I'm the author of Twisted Sisters, How Four Superstorms Forever Changed the Northeast in 1954 and 55. Now, I wrote this book very end of 2013 and into the winter of 2014 to coincide with the 60th anniversaries of the great 1950s New England hurricanes, which for reasons that I will go into tonight have been largely forgotten about in our region, even though these storms forever rewrote New England. So tonight we're going to delve into the incredible true story of the Twisted Sisters and how they impacted New England, but particularly Enfield, Connecticut. We're going to finish our presentation tonight, I think, with some scanned photos from Enfield showing some of the local damage caused by these storms. So basically, I'm going to sort of dedicate the first 35 or 40 minutes of this evening's get-together to going over the storms, what these four storms were all about, and why they were so destructive. And then I'm going to open it up for questions and answers, and then toward the end, give people a chance to check out the book at the back and buy copies if you're interested in doing so, and to take a look at some of the wonderful slides that Enfield citizens have put together of images of these storms. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. To begin this story, it's important to remember the 16 years of terror New England sustained between 1938 and 1955. Now, many of us have probably heard of the famous no-name hurricane of 1938. Now, hurricanes go on a classification system called the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. The very weakest hurricanes are Category 1 storms, and the very strongest storms are Category 5 hurricanes, which are abominably destructive, incredibly powerful winds in excess of 175 miles per hour in some cases for Category 5 storms. The kind of storms that can demolish even wood frame buildings like this one and would leave only brick buildings standing in their path. So the famous 1938 hurricane arrived completely unexpected in New England as a Category 5 hurricane, one of just two Category 5 hurricanes in the 20th century. The only one more recent than 1938 was the devastating Hurricane Andrew, which struck Florida in 1992. Now, when the Hurricane of 38 came ashore, it caused incredible damage across New England. 600 people lost their lives. Entire towns in Rhode Island were washed away. Almost all of their buildings swept out to sea. And nearly 3 million trees in northern New England were toppled. Now, in 1944, during the dark years of World War II, as we began to see a little bit of a glimmer of hope, and as we neared victory at the end of World War II, New England was slammed again by another nearly as strong hurricane, the hurricane of 1944, which similarly was an unnamed storm, but struck with just almost as much devastating fury as 1938. Now, by the early 1950s, New Englanders were sort of almost getting used to this pattern of very devastating storms every few years, but it had been a little bit of a lull. 1944, 10 years passed, there was a few small hurricanes that came up the coast and hammered into parts of Cape Cod or into Maine, but New England had been lucky for the first time in a little while, so it had a little lull in these storms. But as we got to the mid-1950s, we hit a patch of really, really intense hurricanes that came nearly back to back. The Twisted Sisters, which I'll explain in just a second. Now, first of all, to give you a sense of what these storms were all about, imagine just incredible chaos and devastation throughout the region. This is a really great color photo from the summer of 1955, taken in Southbridge, Massachusetts, showing National Guard troops deploying to the town shortly after floodwaters in this entire low-lying area by the American Optical Factory. Those waters finally dropped and allowed troops to come in with supplies for the residents of Southbridge, who had been cut off from the outside world for something like 2 days by the floodwaters that had churned out of the QUINEBAUG River during the last of the Twisted Sisters storms. But many storms in the Twisted Sisters period, 1954 to 55, brought this kind of trouble to the region. It's an interesting view of sort of the hurricane tracks of the time. So each of these lines shows where the center of one of these storms traveled, the eye of the storm, and so the most intense part of the storm circles right around the eye, and so it hit these areas spiraling far away to the north into Nova Scotia and southern Canada. So if you look at the tracks, you look at this. So for the hurricane of 38 right here, it kind of zips back over here at Edmonton, Vermont, knocking down those 3 million trees in northern New England. But if you notice, when we get to the 1950s, first we have, obviously, the storm of 44, which goes further out to sea. But in the 1950s, we get hit head-on by these hurricanes, many of them following almost the same path across the region as they turn up week after week. I think it's important to talk a little bit about what hurricanes are. Now, this is an interesting question because we actually have hurricanes in the sort of temperate and near-tropical oceans all around the world's equator. But we call them different things in different places. So in the Atlantic, we call them hurricanes, from an ancient Carib word, hurricane, which is referring to those type of storms. The Japanese have a different type of word to refer to the same sorts of storms in the Pacific, so they call them typhoons when they hit China or Taiwan or South Korea. And people in Australia and basically the Indian Ocean out to East Africa call them cyclones. All the same type of storms in each place, but they go by different names. So essentially what happens is that with a hurricane, you have a mixing of warm and cold air. So I've actually been right near here, the Cape Verdean Archipelago off of Senegal, which is the birthplace for all of the Atlantic hurricanes that we experience. And basically we end up getting these kind of weird mixes of high and low pressure, warm and cold air that begin to create these great cyclones over the eastern Caribbean Sea. And slowly these things can build up speed around a low pressure area and create this tremendous cyclonic force with incredible revolving winds that can, in some cases, climb to 175 miles per hour and drop incredible quantities of rain when they strike shore. So essentially when these storms get moving, they tend to track north and then sometimes head back out to sea. In other cases, they head more inland, and that's when we have real problems when they come ashore and really impact people. Now, in the 1950s, we had experienced quite a few hurricanes in the United States, but we were only just beginning to understand what was going on inside of these hurricanes. Now, the folks responsible for this, at least in part, were working out of this office building in Miami. The predecessor of today's National Weather Service, the U.S. Weather Bureau, had an office in this big, fancy hotel building in Miami, which was the main, basically, storm forecasting center for hurricanes for the U.S. in the early 50s. So whenever they got word through a ship out at sea off the eastern seaboard of the U.S. or in the Caribbean that they were encountering a really serious storm, they would make a note of it, make a note of the position of the ship, and we have a potential hurricane out at sea. And so they would keep track of this and begin to post these as news bulletins on the radio or even on early television channels in some cases. Now, to confirm that these reports were actually real, the Weather Bureau put new tools to use. There were plenty of surplus bombers after World War II and the Korean War, so they pressed B-29s and B-50 bombers into service flying out into these storms. You can imagine the amount of courage it must have taken for these crews to sit there, jiggling through these storms, trying to control these stubborn aircraft as they flew directly into these storms to measure their wind speed and the velocity of the storm's movement. The other thing that the Weather Bureau used for the first time ever was a technology called Doppler radar, which is today what we use to get our weather radar, basically from AccuWeather or NECN or the Weather Channel, you name it. The weather radar we see in that is always Doppler radar. So this is actually an image of one of the 1950s hurricanes taken as a snapshot of a radar screen. So for the first time we had all these new tools to kind of keep track of these storms. But all these things were still in their infancy. As we discovered in August 1954. So at the very end of August, New Englanders were feeling a little bit down. It had been a pretty rainy summer. You all know rainy summers. We've all had summers like that. And so, particularly in Rhode Island and in coastal Connecticut, many people in little coastal towns like westerly Rhode Island were a little disappointed because basically there hadn't been much summer traffic. It had been too rainy. A lot of businesses were losing money in the vacation areas, and people were settling in for another school year and another year of hard work ahead of them. When, lo and behold, a tremendous storm comes ashore. Now, this is actually some of the images. This is from Rhode Island. It's a famous yacht club at the time, which was inundated and washed away by the storm. And this is houses torn from their foundations in western, southernmost part of Rhode Island. What's so interesting, though, is that in spite of all the new technology that the Weather Bureau had, it was still pretty crummy technology in some ways. So they had weather radar, but it wasn't super accurate yet. They couldn't tell for sure what they were seeing offshore. And particularly with many of the storms, if ships began to avoid a storm out at sea, they stopped having reports about it because they were still mostly reliant on ships for this information. So on a Tuesday morning in Providence, people are arriving at work in their office buildings, doing their office jobs. And around 10:30 in the morning, the Weather Bureau comes on the radio with an emergency broadcast announcing that a hurricane is imminent for Rhode Island. Within 15 minutes, the hurricane had made landfall and flooded downtown Providence to a depth of 8 feet. This was one guy trapped in his office building like thousands of others in Providence, looking out at the suddenly flooded streets of the city. The same flooding was seen all throughout southern New England, in Connecticut, in southeastern Massachusetts. This is actually a police cruiser stuck in water down in southern Rhode Island. They weren't expecting out on their patrol to be flooded all of a sudden. And so Hurricane Carol arrived with tremendous force, creating a storm surge. So basically, it had high winds driving water ashore at a time of high tide. So basically, that water was driven much further inland than it might ordinarily have been. This is the great color image from Fairhaven Harbor, right across from New Bedford in southeastern Mass. And look at this trolley here. This thing's been heaved up on the shore, nearly took out these rail cars here. And the same scene was repeated throughout New England as cities and low-lying areas throughout sort of southern New England were flooded by the storm. In many cases, people lost power. It was very, very common for massive blackouts to take place across southern New England as a result of the storm. Telephones were out, roads were flooded, branches were down. Chaos ensued as a result of this unexpected storm. Now, any guesses on what this might be?
North Church, Boston.
Yes, absolutely, thank you. This is the steeple of the Old North Church, the one where Paul Revere famously got his messages for basically the launch of America's independence. And the storm was actually so powerful, even 50, 60 miles removed from Long Island Sound, that it actually toppled the steeple of the Old North Church with its high winds. This is an interesting software model of folks that today's National Weather Service put together. And it shows the height above tide level of the storm surge during Hurricane Carol, but this could also be applied to similar storms today if we were to see the same thing happen. And if you look at this, the warm colors indicate the areas where incredible storm surges take place. In some cases, right up here in Providence or down in Buzzards Bay, as much as 16 feet above normal levels. And of course, the storm also had an impact inland as it dropped incredible quantities of water across the moon. Within 15 minutes, suddenly you have 3 inches of rainfall. That's a lot of rain, by the way, in a very short space of time. Okay, so Hurricane Carol was a pretty bad deal for New England and for a lot of the other areas of the U.S. that got crushed by it. But within 1 week, we had a storm just as powerful come ashore on September 11th, 1954. Hurricane Edna did the exact same thing, driving boats ashore, toppling trees, flooding towns, flooding roadways, knocking out power in areas that had just the day before put the power back on and cleaned up the streets. Jeez, that's rough. That's all I've got to say. Could you imagine coming home and finding just as much damage done as by the first storm just after you cleaned it up? So people were pretty taken aback by this sudden turn of events. 2 very, very powerful storms back to back. This is a great photo. I love this one. This is a group of sailors in Montauk at the end of New York's Long Island. And the winds from Hurricane Edna are so strong, they can lean forward into them without falling over. This is a scene that was repeated throughout New England during both Hurricane Carol and Hurricane Edna. This is a view from Danvers, Mass. You notice these huge trees just torn apart here in the street. In many cases, trees fell on cars. In some cases, they fell on houses, perhaps more destructively. And many roadways were actually blocked by the amount of downed branches, which of course also took down power lines and telephone lines as well. gotta say, I feel a little bit bad for this kid. It looks like he really wants to go to DQ for a nice vanilla cone, but I'm afraid DQ's closed because of the flood. So this is a great view from Franklin, showing some of the flooding, even quite a ways inland from Hurricane Edna. Now, the kind of unusual thing about Hurricane Carol and Hurricane Edna combined, they became America's first billion-dollar storms. Now, of course, today we have multi-billion-dollar storms every single time we have a hurricane, but imagine the amount of destruction you need to have a billion-dollar storm in 1954 at a time when basically you can multiply, basically based on inflation, that amount by 8. So today that would be an $8 billion storm if it happened again in New England. That's the kind of destruction we're talking about. So about a year goes by, and people are still kind of reeling and cleaning up from the storms of the early fall, late summer of 1954. And people were getting pretty tired of this nonsense. You know, they've had 1938, 1944, the two back-to-back storms of 1954. It's like, gosh, can we be done with these storms? But of course, nature always has more in store for us. This is this Doppler radar image from the Weather Bureau of Hurricane Connie, which began to form and move up the coast in the early and middle of August of 1955. Now, Hurricane Connie was actually the strongest of the four storms initially, reaching Category 4 status, so a very powerful hurricane. But by the time it actually reached New England, it largely dissipated. People were actually so fed up with these storms that there was a popular petition circulated to Ike, President Eisenhower, asking for him to use nuclear bombs to disperse the storm out at sea. Fortunately, he didn't do that, so we don't glow in the dark. But even though Hurricane Connie lost a lot of velocity, a lot of strength, it still packed a mighty punch in terms of rainfall. This is an image taken from the Baltimore Sun showing downtown Baltimore with quite a bit of flooding taking place in the downtown. And the same scene was repeated right up the coast in New York. Much of the devastation and flooding we saw just a few years ago with Hurricane Sandy was seen in 1955 with Hurricane Connie as subway tunnels and roadways in Manhattan flooded. So Hurricane Connie arrived and dumped just incredible quantities of rain all throughout the region, saturating soil and raising river and lake levels to a point where they simply couldn't accommodate any more water. And of course, you know what nature did? Gave us more water. A week later, you see another pattern here? Within a week of each other, tremendous storms, Hurricane DIANE arrived with just as much rain as Hurricane Connie, except that there was nowhere for that rain to go. So rivers almost immediately overtopped their banks, causing probably the worst flood of the 20th century in New England. This is a great image. This is from Putnam, Connecticut, so in northwest Connecticut, right where Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut meet. And the little tiny town of Putnam certainly felt the brunt of Hurricane DIANE more than almost any other town. This is an interesting image because it actually shows an old mill that was being used to store alkali metals. Now, I don't know if any of you remember anything from chemistry class, but alkali metals don't exist alone in nature because they're incredibly reactive. You get them in contact with air or with water, they light up like that. And so when this old mill gets inundated by the QUINEBAUG River, pretty soon the place is going up in flames as these metals, these big 50-gallon drums are being exposed to the water. My grandfather, who actually worked in Putnam, Connecticut, had a chance to witness this madness firsthand. In fact, part of the side of the building gave way and essentially released a big cluster of these big 50-gallon drums of metals like lithium or magnesium or francium into the river, slamming into rocks in the shallow QUINEBAUG River and exploding like depth charges. Quite a sight to see, I'm sure. Now here in Connecticut, Hurricane DIANE and the ensuing flooding was perhaps the state's worst natural disaster, at least in living memory. These are a collection of images from around the state. Now, you gotta remember, this is basically 10 years after the end of World War II, so many of the people serving in the fire departments or the National Guard or all walks of life in Connecticut were first-hand witnesses to World War II. And for people who flew over the state or drove across the state to help out with cleanup for the disaster, they were simply stunned by the level of devastation in Connecticut. Many people compared it to the devastation done to Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II, except that Mother Nature had wreaked the exact same havoc in just a couple of days instead of 2 years of sustained aerial bombing. And just to give this kind of like, put this in perspective for you, all of the bridges across the Connecticut River were destroyed. 200 dams in Massachusetts and Connecticut were destroyed. In fact, the state of Connecticut was cut in half. People couldn't actually go across Connecticut because all of the road and rail bridges were out on the Connecticut River. So you'd have to loop up through Massachusetts to get to the other side of Connecticut, or fly, or take a boat across the river. That's the kind of damage we're talking about, a state cut in half. Now, in parts of central Massachusetts and Connecticut, people were even worried about cholera outbreaks because they didn't have access to clean water anymore, and sewage treatment plants had failed and overtopped their containers.
This is DIANE.
This is Hurricane DIANE, yeah. But coming on the incredible amount of water left by Hurricane Connie just a week earlier. And just to give you a sense, this is some of the rainfall accumulation in this area. Now, if you look almost sort of the area we're here, we're looking at between 20 and 24 inches of rain in under a week. That's 2 feet of water for every single square foot of ground. Think about that for a second. It's an awful lot of water. Now, this is a few photos that we've put together of Enfield, Connecticut. Now, unfortunately, I'm not a local, so many of you will probably recognize these spots far more than I do, and may even have actual personal stories attached to them. This is Pearl Street looking down into Main Street with floodwaters racing through the downtown in the summer of 1955.
Thomasville Drug is the gray building in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
Next to it is the
Go back here for a second.
market. Across the town tavern is across the way. Battle Wing store is next to it, and just out of range on the right would be J.C. Penney. This was taken from the roof of the fire station. And farther down you can see, I think probably green flats and the really shows bank down there. And that white building is probably favors, way down.
It's another view of Enfield. This looks like probably actually also the fire station, judged by the truck there. And just look at this torrent of water coming down the street here. Like, you wouldn't drown in that much water, but it's enough to sweep you off your feet for sure right there. It's another view of downtown here with the water churning into a low-lying area here by some small stores. Unfortunately, this one's a little bit of a small image, but this shows, I believe, a rail bridge, I think, knocked out. Maybe it's a road bridge. But it looks like the cleanup efforts beginning to take place as they've got a cement truck there to start the recovery process. This is another view of Naugatuck showing just the incredible amount. This is one of the many valleys that was particularly badly affected by those sorts. Look at how deep the water is coming out of the Naugatuck River here. That's up to basically the first floor of these buildings. There's a group of first responders. Looks like they're trying to rescue some folks in a boat from a houseboat back here. And I've been very fortunate to get an excellent set of color photos taken of the storms in Southbridge, Mass. Of course, beyond some of the human destruction and the dozens and dozens of lives lost throughout the region, think about the property damage. This is a great example here. These are some nice new cars, a Nash and probably a Chevy, both chucked into the QUINEBAUG River by the floodwaters, and I'll bet probably write-offs in both cases. It's a very similar scene, except in color, to what we saw here in Enfield. This is again in Southbridge. This is the same sort of scene with water churning across this gas station here. And this is a low-lying area in Southbridge. Known as the Plains. It's a French-Canadian neighborhood. And basically this whole area was swept away. Look at some of these houses torn from their foundations, a whole strip of land cleared by the floodwaters. And if you don't think this was a big news story, I have literally seen news articles about this flood using images of this exact same part of Southbridge, Mass. In newspapers as far away as Germany. So it was it would make international news when this flooding took place here. This gentleman, a local historian from Southbridge, Mass., was kind enough to donate some of his color photos that his father took of the storms. And this is a great view of that same mill we saw in the very first picture. Let's scroll back here for just 1 second. Remind us of how we got to this point. So remember that mill? Remember that? So, turn ahead here really quickly. This is the same mill in 1999. And you'll notice the little markings on the wall, that's for the water levels from various storms. 1955, right here. I think that's about 8, 9, 10 feet there, roughly. Now, why do we talk about the Twisted Sisters? This is an important question to ask when it comes to histories. Partly there's an effort to preserve these stories and to keep them alive and not forget about the people who lost their lives in the destruction that took place in these storms. But there's something unusual about the Twisted Sisters, 1954 and 55, because they really do impact us today. Now, as a result of these storms, for about 20 years, between about 1956 and 1976, the 6 New England states with our large congressional representation were the main natural disaster body for the U.S. in the same way that Louisiana or Alabama probably is today with the wake of Hurricane Katrina. Now, during that time, New England passed basically all kinds of acts and resolves with the Army Corps of Engineers to install all sorts of flood control projects throughout New England. One of the most prominent examples is the Fox Point storm barrier in Providence Harbor to prevent the kind of crazy storm surge we saw in 1954. We've seen similar storm surge barriers put in place in other harbors. This is New Bedford's Fairhaven, and a similar one is in place in Stamford. So to protect these big cities along the coast, we put in these barriers in the harbors. Further inland, the Army Corps also put up 28 flood control dams, so typically dry behind the dams. This is actually one right here where I live. This is the West Hill Dam in Massachusetts, basically holding back floodwaters from heavy snowmelt in the spring of 2005. So these dams are always in place to control rivers and to prevent a repeat of what we saw with the Twisted Sisters. Now, there's a few other things we have to think about with the Twisted Sisters. First of all, they struck at a time when New England was quickly losing ground to the rest of the U.S. and to new places like West Germany and Japan, which were the China of their day back in the 50s, the places where cheap manufacturing could take place. Now, in the 1950s, New England was still a place that made everything from boots to, well, even aircraft. And at the time, New England was, like today, one of the most expensive places in the U.S. to employ people to manufacture things. And when so many mills, dozens, probably even hundreds of factories and mills throughout New England were put out of commission 4 times in a row, or at least 3 times in a row, just counting CONNIE, by these storms, many companies couldn't recover from that. Places did permanently close, and some industries did move on. For some, community spirit helped to keep them alive for a little bit longer. And I speak mainly of this part of Connecticut and of the Naugatuck Valley. There's some great stories from the brass works and the leather works and basically the metalworking shops in that area. Many places, huge mills that employ hundreds, even thousands of people that were shut down, flooded, their machinery clogged with mud, and people worked for sometimes a month or 2 months at a time without pay to restore these mills to working order. So thanks to this incredible community spirit and incredible sort of loyalty between workers and the companies that they work for, loyalty on the part of the companies to their workers, many of these companies were actually able to forestall their ultimate closure until the 70s in some cases, simply because of this incredible show of force by New Englanders. But these storms certainly did have a really big impact on our economy, and changing New England for a place that manufactures things to a place that focuses mainly on services. But we also talk about the Twisted Sisters because they're an important safety reminder about the threat of hurricanes. Now, these are some images from recent years. These are from Hurricane Irene. Now, when Hurricane Irene struck in 2011, it knocked out many people's power, but didn't cause very much damage in most places, except in areas that didn't have the flood control dams that we saw as a result of the 1950 storm. So I speak mainly of southeastern Vermont, which saw incredible amounts of damage. Roadways and bridges washed away, towns inundated, because they didn't really have as many of these dams in place, and were particularly poorly positioned, I guess, in the case of Hurricane Irene. So even though we don't think about hurricanes as really being something we have to worry about this far north, we do, although not all the time. So we saw just a year later in 2012 the incredible impact that storms can still have, particularly when they hit populated, wealthy areas like New York and New England. These are some images for around New York and New Jersey, flooded taxi cabs, that whole house torn in half. And these scenes were seen a little bit in New England, though we sort of dodged the bullet there. But things like Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Sandy are opportunities, they're reminders for us of the potential fury of nature in New England that comes on a cyclical basis. New England can go through periods as much as 40 or 50 years at a time when we don't really have much in the way of hurricane activity. But then we will often see big clusters of hurricanes altogether. Now, for reasons that are not fully understood by climatologists and by meteorologists, the sea surface temperature of the Atlantic Ocean changes a little bit due to reasons not connected to humans on these kind of long cycles, decades at a time. And during times when the sea surface is a little bit warmer than average, you can get more evaporation and more risk of really serious hurricanes. Now, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were one of these periods when the sea surface temperature was much warmer than average, and of course we got these huge clusters of nearly back-to-back storms. We went through a long period when we didn't have that kind of high sea surface temperature, most of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Well, folks, we're back in a period of high sea surface temperature when we're at a much higher risk of seeing storms like this. So we have to be prepared for them, but fortunately we are better positioned than we once were to deal with them, thanks to our basically flood protection dams and to the new radar systems that we've got today. But we still have to be vigilant about these kind of storms. So that brings me to the end of this talk. I will open it up to questions at this point.